I swear, certified mail only ever brings two things: jury duty or the HOA. There's no in-between. No one ever sends certified mail to say, "Hey, great job on life. Here's a check for $1 million and a lifetime supply of good coffee." No. It's always an engraved invitation to a civic nightmare or a meticulously formatted declaration of war from the neighborhood watch. So, when I saw the little green card fluttering in my mailbox, I didn't feel dread. I felt a primal, metallic annoyance, like the sound of a fork scratching porcelain, but for my soul. I signed for it with a flourish, forcing a grim smile on the mail carrier, who looked like she'd just been through a minor war and was ready for a nap. I peeled back the heavy envelope, which felt unnecessarily thick, a sure sign of bureaucratic malice. Inside, the pages were crisp, bound with a staple that was probably forged in the fires of Mount Doom. The title, printed in an aggressive Arial 12-point font, read, "Notice of Non-Compliance and Violation. Case File 48B22. Oh joy. It was the HOA. I settled onto my porch swing, which, I noted with a flicker of irony, was in excellent condition. This whole situation immediately smelled of one thing: Karen. Karen lives 2 houses down, but in her mind, she lives on a throne overlooking the entire subdivision. She is the self-appointed queen of curb appeal, the empress of aesthetics, and the reason I developed a small, nervous tick in my left eye. This wasn't going to be about my lawn edging, too aggressive last time, or my trash cans, 1 hour too early, apparently. This felt like a structural complaint. This felt big. The letter got straight to the point, bypassing the usual 5 paragraphs of self-congratulatory HOA fluff. The issue? My backyard fence. The structure at 1422 Sycamore Lane, I read aloud to my dog, Buster, who was currently attempting to lick his own elbow, is cited as a rickety blight on the community that detracts severely from the neighborhood's median property valuation. Furthermore, the HOA's safety committee, which I assume is just Karen wearing a lanyard, deems it a potential liability hazard, requiring immediate and comprehensive replacement. Buster blinked. "Woof," he seemed to say. "Sounds like the old girl's gone off the deep end again, Alex." My current fence? Look, it wasn't pristine. It was 10 years old, standard issue treated pine, leaning slightly to the left like a weary sailor. But rickety blight? That's pure Karen hyperbole. This is the woman who once spent 45 minutes lecturing me on the scientifically optimal time to retrieve a delivery package so it didn't clash with the morning sunlight. "Remember the gnome incident, Buster?" I muttered. "She reported my one, single, slightly cracked garden gnome for unlicensed outdoor decor that promotes a haphazard lifestyle." Haphazard. I'm an accountant, for crying out loud. I flipped the page, eager to see the specific, juicy details of her newest outrage. The letter included several grainy, badly angled photos of the fence, zoomed in so close you could see the mildew on the screws. It was a masterpiece of selective documentation. The most galling part was the accompanying letter from Karen herself, addressed directly to the HOA president, but clearly designed to be read by everyone, especially me. "The aesthetic degradation caused by the current wooden partition," she wrote, clearly reaching for the nearest thesaurus, "is impacting my ability to enjoy my pristine backyard sanctuary. The sheer visible instability of the lumber makes me fear for the safety of any small children, or indeed, any valuable heirloom birds that might land nearby. It is a visual assault, and frankly, an insult to the collective effort of this community. I laughed, a dry, bitter sound that probably startled a few sparrows. Heirloom birds, Buster? She's worried about heirloom birds getting splinters? The petty meter had just gone full red. She wasn't worried about safety. She was worried that my slightly faded fence made her newly installed, blindingly white, vinyl fence look less impressive. The letter concluded with the consequences, and this is where the sarcasm died, and the real, deep-seated resentment began to boil. Pursuant to Bylaw 7.3, I read, running a finger over the text, a one-time violation fee of $500 is assessed immediately. $500. For an old fence that still kept my dog in the yard and most of the world out. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. This was about money. This was personal. This was punitive. And it gets better, boy, I told Buster, who was now resting his chin on my knee. They demand a fully compliant, structurally sound, and aesthetically pleasing replacement must be completed within 60 calendar days of receipt of this notice. Failure to comply will result in further escalation, including daily fines and mandatory removal. 60 days. That's a weekend and a half, plus 5 weeks of agonizing calls to contractors. I'd have to tear down the old fence, deal with the dirt, the rain, the noise, and the inevitable HOA inspections, all because one woman decided my fence didn't meet her imaginary standards for heirloom bird safety. I crumpled the violation notice just enough to satisfy my rage, but not so much that I couldn't smooth it out and use it for evidence later. I'm an accountant. Paperwork is my sword and shield. The $500 fine was the spark, but the 60-day deadline, combined with the sheer, unadulterated pettiness of Karen's complaint, was the dynamite. I was going to replace the fence. Oh yes, I was going to replace it in a way that was so aggressively, painfully compliant that the HOA would weep, and Karen would need to install blackout curtains just to avoid looking at my property line. I paced the length of my living room, the phone pressed against my ear, venting, to my college friend, Mike, who lives 3 states away and exists solely to listen to my homeowner drama. So I asked her, Mike, what exactly is rickety about it? And she just sniffed and said, It looks rickety, Alex. It needs gravitas. Gravitas? I swear to God, the next time someone uses the word gravitas about a perimeter barrier, I'm going to lose it. Mike, bless his heart, was trying to be helpful. Okay, deep breaths. So what's the plan? Just buy some nice cedar planks? Maybe a cool, dark stain? No, Mike, no, that's what they expect. That's the path of least resistance. That gives Karen the satisfaction of knowing her bureaucratic tantrum achieved the desired result. I can't do that. I have to weaponize compliance. I have to make her regret reporting me for the rest of her natural life. I started spiraling, pacing faster. She wants aesthetically pleasing? Fine. I'll give her the aesthetic of impenetrable, code-compliant spite. I'm going to find the most ridiculously solid, expensive, non-depreciating material on the planet. I'm talking about something that won't just last for 30 years, but will actively intimidate the neighborhood. I paused for dramatic effect, leaning against the kitchen counter. Wood? Too soft. Vinyl? Too common. Brick? Too charming. You know what I'm thinking? There was a hesitant pause on the other end of the line. Alex, no. What are you thinking? Please tell me you're not talking about reinforced steel. No, Mike. I'm thinking granite. Solid. Polished. Granite, 6 feet tall. A wall. Not a fence. A barrier. Silence. Then Mike's voice, a horrified whisper. Dude, do you know how much that costs and how much it weighs? That's not a fence. That's a Cold War bunker. Exactly, I shouted, throwing my hands in the air. She wants structurally sound? This thing will survive the apocalypse. She wants aesthetically pleasing? It'll be polished. It'll reflect her house back at her. It'll be the most expensive act of passive aggression ever constructed in this zip code. I hung up before Mike could talk me out of it. The idea had started as a joke, a rhetorical extreme. But now, holding the crumpled violation notice and staring out at the sad, graying pine fence, I realized it was the only way. The only proper, satisfying, and legally sound way to wage war against the tyranny of Karen and her heirloom birds. My spite-fueled destiny had begun. I needed to find a man who could build a monument to my compliance. My first step was, naturally, denial. I Googled premium fence options near me. That led me to Gary. Gary from Gary's Great Gates and Good Wood. He drove a sensible pickup truck, wore a sensible polo shirt, and looked like a man who believed in the power of a finely sanded deck. He walked the property line, nodding professionally. Yeah, Alex, this pine is shot. We can get you set up with some beautiful cedar. Maybe a deep mahogany stain. Keep the squirrels out, keep the light in. What kind of aesthetic are we shooting for? I watched Karen peeking out from behind her sheer curtains. This was it. The moment of truth. Aesthetic, Gary? We are shooting for permanence. We are shooting for impenetrability. We are shooting for the kind of boundary that says, you live there, I live here, and never the twain shall meet, not even for a misplaced dandelion. Gary blinked, pulling out a small notepad. Right, so 6-foot cedar, maybe 8 feet for privacy? 6 feet, I confirmed, per HOA code. Now, about the material. Gary beamed. Well, for an upgrade, cedar's the gold standard. We can do pressure-treated, no wood, Gary. Oh, right. Composite, then. Low maintenance, looks like wood, lasts forever. We've got a great slate gray. No composite, Gary. He paused, his pen hovering over the notepad. Okay, not a problem. What about a nice wrought iron? Classic look, very high-end. No iron. Too easy to climb. Not enough gravitas. I paused, savoring the look of confusion on his face. Gary, I want you to give me a quote on a 6-foot-tall, solid wall of black galaxy polished granite. Gary's jaw dropped. It wasn't a slow, thoughtful drop. It was a sudden mechanical failure of his facial muscles. His notepad slipped from his hand and fell silently onto the damp grass. I'm sorry, he finally managed, his voice cracking. Did you say polished granite? Like for a kitchen countertop? No, Gary, I corrected impatiently. Like for a structural perimeter barrier. The kind that requires a dedicated 10-foot-deep concrete footer because black galaxy granite weighs, conservatively, 150 pounds per cubic foot. I want each slab to be 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and about 4 inches thick. Solid through and through, seamless joints, polished to a mirror sheen on both sides, though honestly the reflection on Karen's side is a bonus. He looked from me to the old pine fence, then back to me, his eyes wide with genuine panic. Sir, he stammered, shaking his head slowly, that's not a fence. That's a segment of the Great Wall of China. That's not my line of work. My truck. It carries cedar planks, not geological formations. I think you need a different guy. He practically ran back to his sensible truck, leaving his notepad behind. He was the first casualty of the spite wall. I picked up the notepad, wrote, "Not a good fit. Too much cedar, not enough stone on the cover," and tossed it into my recycling bin. The next stage required a significant jump in professionalism. I found Salvatore & Sons Structural Masonry. Their website showed photos of bridges, municipal buildings, and the occasional fortress-like estate entry. This was the right league. Salvatore, a man who looked exactly like his name sounded, wearing a hard hat and a look of permanent skepticism, showed up in an enormous, diesel-fueled beast of a truck. He didn't ask about aesthetics. He asked about load-bearing capacity. "So the job," Salvatore said, hands on his hips, surveying the gentle slope of my backyard. "Your girl on the phone said you want a 6-foot wall. Boundary fence?" "A boundary wall, Salvatore," I corrected. "Perimeter, 6 feet high, specific length, 78 feet. And the material is solid, polished, black galaxy granite." Salvatore didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, pulling a tape measure from his belt. "Granite, not veneer, solid slabs." "Solid slabs, 4 inches thick." He stopped measuring, squinted at me, and pointed a thick, calloused finger at my house. "You building a retaining wall for a bank? Or are you preparing for a siege?" I leaned in, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Salvatore, I am building a monument to code compliance. My neighbor," I jerked my thumb toward Karen's house, "filed a complaint saying my current fence was rickety. I intend to replace it with a structure that will be geologically stable for the next 3 millennia. Salvatore's eyes narrowed, but a slow grin spread across his face. It was the grin of a man who understood the fundamental power of doing something extra just to prove a point. "I like the way you think, kid," he rumbled. "This is not a fence job. This is a monument job. We gotta talk weight. That much granite needs a footer deep enough to anchor a skyscraper. We're talking serious rebar, serious concrete. The ground here is clay. We're going 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, just for the foundation." He started sketching rapid fire on a piece of graph paper. Then the cuts. We have to custom cut and polish those slabs. Black Galaxy is tough. Beautiful, but tough. Expensive. You're looking at 6 figures easy, just for the stone and the transport. You aware of that? "I am aware, Salvatore," I said, pulling out the crumpled HOA letter and flattening it on the hood of his truck. "And I consider it an investment in my long-term happiness." He looked at the letter, glanced at Karen's house, and then looked back at me. "All right, you got the money, I got the crew. You, my friend, have got some serious spite. I respect that. We'll use the Blue Pearl, though. Black Galaxy is too subtle. Blue Pearl? It sparkles. It's impossible to ignore." I shook his hand. "Blue Pearl it is, Salvatore. Let's make it shine." After Salvatore left, I spent 3 solid days in my home office, not doing my actual accounting job, but doing something much more important: weaponizing the neighborhood bylaws. I reviewed every single document the HOA had ever sent me, plus the entire city zoning code regarding property line barriers. I was looking for a loophole, but I found something even better: ambiguity around mass. The code was very specific about height. Maximum height of 6 feet from grade level. Check. It was specific about setbacks. Must not encroach upon the neighbor's property line. Check. It was specific about material types. Any non-organic, durable, weather-resistant material is permissible, subject to prior approval. Granite is definitely non-organic and durable. It's literally bedrock. But nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it restrict the mass or the density of the material. A cedar plank fence weighs maybe 50 pounds per linear foot. My proposed Blue Pearl granite wall would weigh nearly 2,000 pounds per linear foot. It was the legal equivalent of replacing a bicycle with a tank, both of which are technically vehicles. I called Salvatore back, feeling like a genius maniac. Salvatore, quick question. When you poured a concrete footer for a 6-foot-tall stone wall, how would a code inspector judge the height? From the finished grade line, kid. From the dirt to the top of the stone. Why? Because the HOA specified 6 feet. If you put a 4-foot footer in, and then pour concrete up to the current grade, and then place the 6-foot stone on top, that means the wall is 10 feet from its base, right? Technically, yes, he confirmed. But only 6 feet from the grass? Only 6 feet from the grass. It's code compliant on the vertical measurement. The depth is structural, not aesthetic. I nearly did a victory lap. Salvatore, you are a master. We need to make sure the top of that wall is a zero-tolerance 6 feet, not 5 feet 11 inches, not 6 feet 1 inch. Perfect. I want them to bring a laser level and confirm it. We are building the most structurally sound, precisely dimensioned, spite-fueled structure in the history of suburban zoning. Salvatore chuckled, a deep, satisfied sound. You got it, Alex. 0 tolerance. I'll update the bid. The final number is astronomical, but worth every penny. With the final, mind-numbingly large bid in hand, I headed to the city zoning office to get the permit. This was interaction number 3 with bureaucracy, and frankly, I was enjoying my newfound role as a code compliance crusader. I walked up to the counter, handed the enormous stack of blueprints, stamped and signed by Salvatore, to the municipal worker, Brenda. Brenda was a woman whose soul had been systematically drained by 17 years of dealing with people who wanted to build sunrooms where they shouldn't, or paint their houses colors that were definitely not beige. She glanced at the plans. Foundation depth, 4 feet. Structure height, 6 feet. Material. Let me see. Blue pearl granite slabs, polished finish. She looked up at me, her expression changing from terminal boredom to genuine alarm. Wait, granite? For a fence? She flipped through the pages, her finger tracing the dimensions. Sir, are you building a mausoleum? Should I call someone? Is this a defense mechanism? It's a perimeter barrier, Brenda, I explained, leaning over the counter. My HOA cited my previous barrier as rickety and as potential liability. I am simply ensuring that the new barrier cannot, under any circumstances, be described using those adjectives. Brenda closed the file and rubbed her temples. Look, I've seen some things, but granite perimeter walls are not usually one of them. It's highly unusual. But is it compliant? She sighed, defeated. She cross-referenced the numbers, checked the setbacks, and finally stamped the permit with a heavy thwack. It's compliant. You meet all the structural requirements. The height is exactly 6 feet. The materials are durable. This is insane, but it's legal. Don't be late on the start date, and keep the noise within regulated hours. I retrieved the permit, a masterpiece of bureaucratic approval, and felt a warmth spread through my chest that was much better than coffee. The financing was the least fun part. The estimated cost for the entire project, including foundation, labor, and the shimmering blue pearl slabs imported from Norway, was equivalent to a down payment on a decent house. I walked into my bank, feeling a mixture of pride and total self-loathing, and applied for a hefty second mortgage. My banker, a very conservative woman named Mrs. Peterson, looked at the loan request form. This is for a home improvement, Alex? New kitchen? Pool? No, Mrs. Peterson. It's for a fence replacement. A $100,000 fence replacement? A $100,000, 6-foot-tall, solid, polished blue pearl granite wall replacement, I corrected. It's a structural asset. She just shook her head, stamped the paperwork, and muttered, "You millennials and your spite projects." I left the bank, now indebted to my eyeballs, but holding the golden ticket to Karen's permanent existential dread. The stage was set. The day the project started, I knew Karen was watching. I could practically feel her internal temperature rising. She probably had a high-powered lens trained on my property line, waiting to spot the first minor infraction, the wrong shade of safety vest, a truck parked slightly too far over the yellow line, a discarded Starbucks cup. The arrival of the heavy machinery was less an installation and more an invasion. At exactly 7:00 a.m., the earliest legal start time, the convoy arrived. First, Salvatore's immense mud-splattered crew cab. Second, a huge excavator on a lowboy trailer, the kind of machine usually reserved for digging tunnels, not property line footers. Third, the cement mixer truck, followed by the flatbed carrying the first massive pallet of granite. The noise level immediately spiked. The air brakes hissed like an angry snake. The heavy machinery whined as it backed into my driveway. My driveway looked less like a suburban street and more like a staging area for a hostile takeover. I went out and met Salvatore. He was wearing a grin under his hard hat. "Morning, Alex," he said, his voice cheerful over the roar of a reversing truck. "Hope you got earplugs. We gotta get loud before we get pretty." "Morning, Salvatore. You bring the noise, I'll bring the paperwork. We're within all legal hours, right?" "Of course. But the sound of that excavator is the sound of economic anxiety for your neighbor, I bet. It's glorious." I gave him the thumbs up. Salvatore's crew, about 6 stoic men who looked like they'd been building things since the Romans, immediately went to work tearing out the old pine fence. It took them less than 20 minutes to reduce the rickety blight to a pile of splinters. The difference was immediate and jarring. For 78 feet, there was nothing but a gap of bare earth. A temporary wound, soon to be replaced by a permanent scar. The excavator started digging the footer trench. The sound was deafening, a grinding, earth-shaking rumble. Dirt flew. Clay piled up. I watched the bucket descend 4 feet into the earth, just as planned. This wasn't a hole for a fence post. This was a grave for the notion of neighborly pettiness. It took Karen exactly 35 minutes to surface. She emerged from her front door wearing an expensive workout ensemble, marching with the purposeful gait of someone who was about to lecture a drill sergeant on his poor posture. She headed directly toward Salvatore, wisely avoiding me. Excuse me, she called out, hands on her hips, shouting over the excavator. "What exactly is the nature of this work? I only received a vague notice that a fence was being replaced. This looks like a municipal project. There is an excavator in the middle of a residential street." Salvatore, who was directing the excavator operator with hand signals, turned slowly. He was a master of silent, professional intimidation. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice completely level and surprisingly loud. "Salvatore Marino, structural masonry. We're constructing a perimeter barrier." "A barrier? That hole is enormous. You're digging up the property line. Is this for drainage? A new sewer line?" "No, ma'am. This is a structural footer for the perimeter wall." Karen's eyes widened. She focused on the pallet of massive, shimmering slabs of blue pearl granite sitting on the flatbed truck. The sun caught the reflective, iridescent flecks in the stone, making it look like a celestial object. "And what is that material?" she asked, her voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "That, ma'am, is blue pearl solid granite," Salvatore replied, emphasizing the word solid. 4 inches thick, 6 feet high. We are beginning the slab placement after the concrete pour tomorrow. Karen took a step back, visibly recoiling. Granite? A 6-foot granite wall? Mr. Marino, that is highly irregular. That is not what the HOA approved. That is excessive. That is hostile architecture. Salvatore shrugged, completely unbothered. Ma'am, I only build according to the stamped, approved blueprints and the material. Specifications provided by the homeowner, Mr. Alexander, right here. He pointed directly at Miamo. I offered Karen a small wave, full of fake cheer. It's structurally sound, Karen. Per your complaint. She ignored me, focusing her fury back on Salvatore. I will be contacting the Homeowners Association immediately. This noise, this spectacle, and this monstrosity of a material will not stand. You will be issued a stop work order within the hour. Salvatore pulled off his hard hat and wiped his forehead with the back of his glove. You do that, ma'am. My crew and I only stop for the city, not for a complaint. Until then, we're digging, and it's going to get a lot louder before it gets quieter. Karen spun on her heel and stomped back to her house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle her own perfectly manicured windows. As promised, the chaos escalated. About 2 hours later, just as the crew was finishing the trench and starting to drop the rebar cage into the 4-foot hole, a police cruiser rounded the corner. It wasn't a speeding approach. It was a slow, weary roll, clearly the result of a non-emergency complaint. The officer, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, got out. He had the distinct look of someone who dealt with way too many dog park disputes and unapproved lawn ornaments. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said, addressing Salvatore first, since the foreman looked more like the man in charge. "Got a complaint about noise and unpermitted construction. You the site supervisor?" "That'd be me, officer," Salvatore said calmly. "Noise is within regulated hours. And permits? We got 'em." He looked at me. I was ready. I'd set up a fold-out table in the driveway, covered it with a checkerboard tablecloth, because why not add a little touch of absurdity, and stacked my files. I pulled the heavy, stamped folder from the stack and handed it to the officer. "Officer," I said smoothly, "my name is Alex. This is the city-approved permit, stamped by Brenda at zoning, for the construction of a perimeter barrier. Approved materials, blue pearl granite. Approved height, 6 feet. Approved hours, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. We are currently 10:45 a.m. The officer thumbed through the blueprints, his face unreadable. He saw the specs for the deep footer, the granite material, and the zero-tolerance height. He looked at the massive trench, the rebar cage, and the mountains of granite. He looked at Karen's house, where a curtain twitched frantically. He handed the permit back. "Everything looks in order, sir. You're good to go." He walked over to the edge of my lawn, put 2 fingers to his temple in a universal sign of "I don't get paid enough for this," and then pointed at Karen's house. I could hear the muffled, one-sided conversation over the thrum of the excavator. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but the homeowner has all the proper permits. The noise level is within the city's allowed decibel range for construction during these hours. They are compliant. There's nothing we can do. You'll have to take this up with the HOA, but I recommend checking their codes first." He got back into his cruiser, shook his head at me, and drove off, probably craving a donut and a transfer to a quieter district. I gave Salvatore another triumphant thumbs up. The rest of the day was dedicated to the footer. It was brutal, noisy work. The rebar cage was tied together, looking like the skeletal remains of a T-Rex. Then, the next morning, the cement truck returned. A much bigger one this time, full of high-strength concrete. The pour was epic. It took hours of steady, messy, professional work to fill the 78-foot-long, 4-foot-deep trench. That much concrete is a serious commitment. It was a visible, permanent transformation of the property line. It wasn't just a foundation, it was a statement. I narrated the process internally. There goes my retirement fund, Karen, solidly poured into the ground, just to ensure my property boundary has adequate gravitas. I watched the crew smooth the top of the concrete, leveling it perfectly to the current grade. The slab foundation was massive, wide, and utterly unmoving. When it cured, that wall wasn't going anywhere. Not in a hurricane, not in a minor earthquake, and certainly not because of an HOA complaint. As the crew started cleaning up their tools, waiting for the concrete to set, I grabbed my keys. "Hey, Salvatore, lunch is on me. Everything within a 10-mile radius is getting pizza. What does the Granite crew prefer?" Salvatore smiled, pulling off his gloves. "Meat lovers, Alex. You're a good man. You got the respect of the entire crew, you know that. We usually build walls to protect valuable things, like gold or important people. This is the first time we've built a wall just to protect a man's sanity." I chuckled. "It's a multi-purpose structure, Salvatore, mostly spite-fueled asset protection." I went and grabbed the lunch, leaving the massive, still damp concrete strip curing in the sun. I knew Karen was watching the whole time. She was watching the quiet professionalism of the crew, the immense scale of the foundation, and the fact that I was buying them lunch. Every single drop of concrete poured into that trench was a tiny, delicious victory. The foundation cured in 3 days. And then the real show began. The blue pearl granite slabs were unloaded. Each one was enormous, requiring a forklift or 4 very burly men with custom straps to move. Salvatore's crew, however, had the whole process down to a brutal, balletic science. They mixed industrial-strength mortar, used specialized suction cups and lifts, and gently, slowly lowered the 6-foot-tall, 4-inch-thick slabs into place. The joints between the slabs were hairline-thin, barely visible. They were meant to look like one seamless, continuous slab of rock, pulled from the earth. As they worked, the wall began to rise, a shimmering blue-gray streak against the faded green of the suburban lawn. But the final aesthetic touch, the pièce de résistance, was the polishing. Once all the slabs were set, Salvatore's team brought out specialized diamond pads and water feeds. They spent 2 days buffing and polishing the stone. The granite, already beautiful, transformed. It became a perfect obsidian mirror, shot through with iridescent flecks of blue and silver that glittered in the sun. I walked the length of the wall on my side, running my hand over the cool, flawless surface. It didn't just look expensive. It looked like it belonged on a Roman emperor's property portfolio. It was utterly silent, utterly solid, and so perfectly finished that you could see every blade of grass, every cloud, and every window from Karen's house reflected in the stone. The aesthetic was not charming, nor was it rickety. It was uncompromising. It was the perfect fusion of natural beauty and industrial-grade resentment. Karen wanted aesthetically pleasing? This was aesthetically terminal. The construction site reached its climax on a Saturday morning. The crew had finished the final polishing and removed all the temporary safety fencing and the last tarps. The 78-foot wall of shimmering blue pearl granite stood fully exposed. It was majestic, imposing, and completely, hilariously out of place in our quiet little neighborhood of vinyl and pine. I was standing on my lawn, admiring the sheer, defiant perfection of it, when the noise level went from the usual suburban hum to a high-pitched feminine screech. Karen stormed out of her house. She was holding her phone like a weapon, her face a mask of incandescent fury. She wasn't just mad, she was betrayed. She thought she'd ordered a nice little cedar fence. I'd delivered a permanent geological feature. She marched right up to the wall, standing close to her side. The side that reflected her house perfectly. She jabbed a finger at the stone, the reflection of her own hand obscuring her face. "Alex, what in the name of God is this?" she shrieked, totally ignoring the fact that Salvatore and his crew were standing nearby, loading up the final bits of equipment. "Good morning, Karen," I said, crossing my arms. "I assume you mean my new, fully code-compliant perimeter barrier?" "Barrier? This is a fortress. Look at it. It's cold. It's offensive. It's ruining the visual continuity of the neighborhood. You have ruined the property value." I pointed to the wall. "That, Karen, is a non-depreciating, weather-resistant structural asset. I know because my bank approved a second mortgage for it, and I would argue that my property value has gone up considerably simply by eliminating the sight of your lawn from my daily routine." She stamped her foot, nearly slipping on her immaculate, expensive walkway. The HOA required a fence. Replacement! Not the construction of a gargantuan hostile architecture monument. My fence was charming. It had character. "It was rickety and a blight, Karen," I corrected, pulling out a printout of the violation notice from my pocket. I loved having this document. "Your exact words filed with the association on May 14th. You demanded a replacement that was structurally sound and aesthetically pleasing. Well, this is the most structurally sound, aesthetically pleasing, and code-compliant perimeter barrier money can buy. It will not fall down. It will not splinter. It will not harbor mildew. It is perfect." She was speechless for a full 10 seconds, which is a record for Karen. She was staring at the wall, then at the printout in my hand, realizing the legal trap she had sprung on herself. "I will report this to the city. They will make you tear it down. It violates the spirit of the community agreement." "You're welcome to try, Karen," I replied, my smile genuine and wide. But the city zoning department already signed off on the permit. Mr. Harrison, the senior inspector, found 0 violations. The wall is exactly 6 feet high per code. Its density is unrestricted by code. It's permanent. Enjoy the view of yourself. I gave her a little salute. She let out a small, strangled sound, the sound of pure administrative defeat, and retreated back inside. The phone call came 2 days later, summoning me to an emergency evening HOA board meeting. This was it, the legal battle climax. I walked into the clubhouse meeting room, a place usually reserved for terrible bake sales and tedious quarterly updates, to find the entire 7-person HOA board sitting at a long table, flanked by their bewildered secretary. The air was thick with panic. The HOA president, a nervous man named Tom, cleared his throat. "Alex, thank you for coming. We are here, as you know, to discuss the thing on your property line." "You mean my new perimeter barrier, Tom?" I supplied cheerfully. "Yes, the granite wall," Tom said, sighing. "It's been described to us as a fortress, a visual assault, and a declaration of war." "By Karen, I assume," I said. "And yet, what is the violation?" Another board member, Mrs. Dubois, chimed in, her voice trembling. "It violates the harmony of the neighborhood, Alex. We are a community of shared aesthetics. It's like putting a tuxedo next to a pair of shorts." "Mrs. Dubois, with all due respect, I was given a formal violation notice that stated my previous structure was a blight and a liability." I replaced it with a multi-ton, premium-grade material that is demonstrably superior in every metric you care to measure. I have the city permit, stamped by code enforcement. I leaned forward. Let me save you some time. You can spend thousands on a lawyer trying to enforce a subjective aesthetic standard, or you can read your own documents. I've highlighted the relevant sections. I slid a binder across the table. Show me the section that says a perimeter barrier must be made of organic material. Show me the section that restricts density. Show me the section that says a wall must not exceed X amount of dollars. You won't find it. What you will find is the provision that says the structure must be maintained, structurally sound, and under 6 feet. This wall is perfect on all counts. If you fine me, I will countersue for the initial $500 fine, the entirety of my construction costs, and emotional damages due to the initial false complaint. That granite wall is my evidence. Tom put his head in his hands. The board members exchanged terrified glances. They realized I hadn't just built a wall. I had built an impenetrable legal defense. I had weaponized compliance, and they were the casualties. The HOA meeting didn't end with a solution, but with a whimper. Tom said they would consult with counsel, which is HOA speak for, we will spend $5,000 to find out we're totally screwed. The day after the meeting, however, I got another visitor. This one was different. He pulled up in a nondescript white sedan, wore a crisp, clean shirt, and had a demeanor of world-weary competence. This was Mr. Harrison, the high-level code enforcement inspector. Not the bored cop, not the tired clerk, but the guy who gets called in for the truly bizarre, boundary-pushing stuff. He didn't bother knocking. He walked straight to the wall, pulled out a small, incredibly expensive-looking laser device, and started taking measurements. I walked out to meet him. Mr. Harrison? Alex. Pleasure to meet the man who signed off on the madness. He didn't smile. He just focused on the wall. The permit for this structure was surprising. I signed off on the blueprints, but I wanted to see the finished product, to check for, let's call them, spirit violations. And what do you think? I asked, genuinely curious about a professional opinion. He took a measurement at the corner. 6 feet, 0 inches, perfectly level, beautiful craftsmanship. Salvatore's crew does good work. The foundation is overkill, but that makes it overcompliant. The material is approved, durable, non-toxic, and non-flammable. He slowly walked the entire 78-foot length, examining the joints and the finish. He stopped at Karen's side, where the mirror-like polish reflected her front bay window with astonishing clarity. I'm guessing the neighbor is the one who complained? She is the one who filed the initial complaint, yes, I confirmed. She requested a structurally sound replacement. Harrison sighed, a deep, full breath that contained the sadness of 1,000 zoning battles. Mr. Alexander, you are technically a genius and legally a monster. You have weaponized the code. You have taken a standard regulation for height and material and made an unassailable point about subjective complaints. I can't find a single thing wrong. With this wall, it's perfect. He put away his laser device, pulled out a final inspection sheet, and signed it with a flourish. Consider this file closed. Good luck with the HOA, but they can't touch this. He got back in his sedan. Before he drove off, he rolled down his window. Just out of curiosity, what did the initial fine cost you? $500. He shook his head and laughed softly. $100 grand worth of granite for a $500 fine. Well played, son. Well played. Sure enough, the HOA board panicked and hired an attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Ms. Chen, who clearly charged 3 times what the board could afford. She didn't send a fine. She sent a 7-page cease and desist letter that was dripping with legal jargon and subtle threats about unreasonable use of property and material incompatibility with established neighborhood covenants. I took the letter straight to my own lawyer, a guy named Rick, who mostly dealt with small business contracts. I had already warned him this was coming, and he was thrilled. Rick viewed this whole scenario as the most entertaining legal chess match of his career. I sat in his office as he read the lengthy, fear-inducing document. He didn't use a red pen. He used a blue one to draw a giant, happy face on the front page. "Okay, Alex," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They're trying to use the catch-all clauses, the General Community Welfare and Aesthetics Committee language. They know you're compliant on the specs, so they're trying to sue you on the feeling of the wall." "Can they?" Rick laughed. "They can try, but you have their initial complaint, which calls the old fence a blight. You have city and county sign-off. We respond with a 1-paragraph masterpiece of compliance." Rick opened his laptop and drafted the reply, reading it aloud to me. "To Ms. Chen Escrone, on behalf of the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association, we have received your correspondence regarding the perimeter barrier at 1422 Sycamore Lane. Please be advised that the structure is fully compliant with all municipal, state, and HOA Chapter 4, Section B, Paragraph 3, codes governing height, setback, and material durability. Furthermore, this barrier is a demonstrably superior replacement for the rickety and liability-prone structure cited in the HOA's own documentation, Case File 48B-22. Any further legal action attempting to enforce a subjective aesthetic standard would be considered harassment, and we would be compelled to countersue for all construction costs, legal fees, and punitive damages. Consider this matter closed." It was perfect. It was a legal grenade. 3 days later, Rick called. Ms. Chen officially dropped the case. She cited a clear absence of grounds to proceed based on the homeowner's meticulous adherence to structural and dimensional bylaws. "Alex, you crushed them. They spent $5,000 just to confirm they were legally wrong." I was so happy I almost did a dance in my kitchen. The HOA had surrendered. The wall was permanent. Karen, however, was not finished. She couldn't attack the wall itself, so she decided to attack the concept of the wall. About a week after the legal surrender, I noticed something new on her side of the granite. She had attached a massive, ugly piece of particle board to her property, right up against the granite, and painted a truly hideous mural on it. It was a painting of a saccharine, sun-drenched cottage with a picket fence and a sign that read, "Welcome to a home with taste." The colors were garish, the painting was amateur, and the particle board was clearly bowing in the middle. It was her final, desperate attempt to ruin the granite wall's aesthetic dominance. I smiled, a cold, predatory smile, and reached for my HOA binder. I took 20 high-resolution pictures of the mural, the non-approved paint, the visible lag screws she'd used to attach the particle board to her own property, and the fact that the particle board itself was clearly starting to warp from the morning dew. I filed a new complaint with the HOA, but this time it was against Karen. I used the precise, obnoxious language she had used against me. The complaint read, "The unauthorized attachment of unapproved non-weather-resistant and aesthetically jarring materials, specifically a particle board mural affixed via metal screws, to the property at 14-24 Sycamore Lane, constitutes a severe violation of the Outdoor Decor and Attachment Clause, Chapter 6, Section A. The use of these unauthorized, rickety materials detracts severely from the neighborhood's median property valuation and presents a potential liability due to structural instability and warping. I knew they were tired of me, but they had to act. I had cited their own rules, and my complaint was 100% legitimate. The response was swift and beautiful. The HOA board, terrified of another lawsuit and utterly exhausted, didn't even waste time with a hearing. They simply sent Karen a certified letter. She was given 7 days to remove the mural or face a $100 daily fine and mandatory HOA enforcement. I watched, through my living room window, as the mail carrier delivered the letter. Karen opened it right there on her porch. Her face went pale, then red. She looked at the wall, she looked at the mural, and she looked down at the letter. 2 days later, she and her husband were out there, angrily prying the ugly particle board mural off their side of the granite wall. They had to be careful not to damage the blue pearl, of course. Once the mural was gone, the granite wall stood there, silent, shimmering, and victorious. I received a final, official letter from the HOA. The structure at 1422 Sycamore Lane is deemed fully compliant, permanent, and in accordance with all neighborhood and municipal codes. Case closed. I didn't celebrate with champagne. I went out, grabbed my favorite microfiber cloth and a gentle stone, cleaner, and spent an hour polishing the entire length of the granite wall, buffing it until it shone like a perfect mirror. It was my final, quiet act of spite-based maintenance. You know you've won the neighborhood war when the battleground becomes a tourist attraction. It started subtly. A few days after Karen was forced to take down her pathetic mural, I was outside, pulling a few weeds near the base of the wall. Old Man Johnson, who lives 3 doors down and only ever communicates in grunts, walked by with his Yorkshire Terrier, Tiny. He stopped dead in his tracks, stared at the wall, and then at me. He slowly approached, pulled his hearing aid out, and pointed a shaky finger at the granite. "Son," he rasped, his voice full of awe. "That is one beautiful piece of spite." I laughed. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I call it the Wall of Spite." He leaned in conspiratorially. "Listen here. I've been living next to that woman for 20 years. She once reported my American flag for being too vibrant. Too vibrant. You, Alex, you did what all of us fantasized about for 20 years. You brought a geologic hammer to a petty knife fight." He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a Ziploc bag containing 2 homemade chocolate chip cookies. He pressed them into my hand. "Keep up the good work." From then on, I was a minor celebrity. Neighbors I'd never spoken to would nod at me with a reverence usually reserved for war heroes or people who knew how to fix a slow internet connection. People would drive slowly past my house. Sometimes I'd see couples walking their dogs, and the woman would elbow the man and whisper, "That's the granite wall guy." One evening, a woman from 4 streets over, who I knew vaguely from the grocery store, dropped off a gift basket. The card read, "Thank you for your service. May your wall always be polished." The wall had transcended being just a fence replacement. It was a symbol. It was a monument to the fact that sometimes, fighting bureaucracy with extreme, beautiful, and expensive compliance is the only way to win. The real amplification, of course, came from the internet. My friend Mike, the one I'd vented to during the moment of madness, had been following the saga with rapt attention. The day the wall was finished, he drove over to visit, just to witness the blue pearl in person. He stood there, jaw slack, running his hand over the polished surface. "Dude, this is transcendent," he whispered. You're a lunatic, and a brilliant, spiteful lunatic. He took a panoramic photo, the towering, shimmering granite wall juxtaposed against Karen's tiny, pristine mailbox and her own perfectly manicured lawn. He posted it on Reddit under the title, "Karen reported my rickety fence, $500 fine. So I replaced it with this. Total cost, $100,000. Worth it." He attached the initial HOA letter as proof. It exploded. I woke up the next morning to 15,000 upvotes and 24 news requests in my inbox. The comments were hysterical. "This is not a fence. This is a non-depreciating, spite-fueled asset." My quote, now a meme. "The neighbors are witnessing the birth of a legend." Imagine having to look at your own defeat every time you walk outside. The wall instantly got a Google Maps tag as the Spite Fortress. I had to go in and confirm I was the owner just to manage the listing. I was getting calls from local news stations, podcasts, and even one morning show in Chicago. The Wall of Spite was officially a national conversation piece. It was hilarious, embarrassing, and completely satisfying. Karen's pettiness had inadvertently launched me into viral stardom, and I had the multi-ton proof right outside my window. I eventually agreed to a brief interview with a local affiliate news crew. They wanted to do a human interest piece on property disputes gone wild. The reporter, a cheerful blonde named Sarah, stood in my front yard, microphone in hand, clearly trying to maintain a straight face while looking at the massive wall. "Alex, this is an incredible, albeit massive structure. The cost alone is staggering. Can you walk us through the emotion that led you to choose solid, imported blue pearl granite for a standard suburban fence line?" I deadpanned into the camera. "It was a matter of compliance, Sarah. My homeowners association demanded a structurally sound replacement for a rickety structure. Granite is arguably the most structurally sound material on Earth. I was simply following their instructions to the most logical and, frankly, beautiful extreme." "But the cost, $100,000 for a fence. Do you have any regrets about the financial outlay?" I paused, looking past the camera to the wall, letting the polished surface reflect the sunlight. Regret? No. It's not a cost. It's a non-depreciating, spite-fueled asset. When I purchased my original pine fence, I was buying an item that would degrade. When I purchased this wall, I was buying peace of mind, a perpetual barrier to petty complaints, and a monument to legal compliance. That is priceless. The camera panned over to the wall, then back to my face. I think the reporter almost cracked a smile. They finished the segment by calling it the Great Wall of Suburbia. The truly ridiculous part, the wall was actually amazing. The blue pearl granite, being a massive thermal mass, did incredible things for my backyard. In the winter, it blocked the wind perfectly, creating a surprising sheltered microclimate on my patio. In the summer, it absorbed the heat during the day and radiated a gentle, low warmth in the evening, making my deck the perfect temperature for late-night grilling. But the best part was the quiet. 78 feet of 4-inch thick, solid rock is an unbelievable sound barrier. I could barely hear traffic anymore. I certainly couldn't hear Karen's small dog yapping or her husband complaining about her aggressive pruning habits. I sat on my deck, sipping my morning coffee, feeling the gentle heat coming off the stone, listening to the blissful silence. The wall didn't just solve a complaint, it genuinely improved my quality of life. It turns out spite, when properly engineered and financed, can be an incredibly effective long-term home improvement strategy. Karen, despite the HOA surrender, the legal defeat, and my viral fame, was not built to quit. She was built of pure, calcified resentment. She saw the wall of spite every day, and it was driving her mad. Her final, spectacular, and utterly ridiculous attempt to defeat the wall came 3 months after the initial construction. One morning, I heard strange noises, not the roaring of Salvatore's equipment, but the anxious murmuring of men who looked like they were barely qualified to operate a leaf blower. They were carrying surveying equipment that looked straight out of a community college rental. I walked outside to find Karen directing 2 clearly nervous, sweaty men to drive wooden stakes into the ground, right next to the granite. "What's going on, Karen?" I asked, keeping my tone light and inquisitive. She looked at me with a triumphant sneer. "I'm establishing the true property line, Alex. You may have fooled the HOA, but you haven't fooled me. These professional surveyors have identified a half-inch encroachment on a pre-existing, legally binding utility easement that was misfiled decades ago." A half-inch. 5 millimeters. She was staking her entire remaining sanity on 5 millimeters of airspace. One of the sweaty surveyors, a young man named Todd, who looked like he regretted his career path, mumbled, It's pretty close, sir. We think the wall might be technically over the line," Karen crowed. "And pursuant to our conversation, I have hired a demolition crew. They will be here this afternoon to remove the encroaching segment. You will pay for the repairs to the granite, Alex. You will pay." I just stood there, staring at the wall, then at the ridiculous tiny wooden stakes. This was a Hail Mary pass so desperate it was orbiting the planet. "Karen," I said, shaking my head, "did you really think I hired Salvatore and Son Structural Masonry, took out a second mortgage, and won a legal battle against the HOA, only to be defeated by a surveyor who drives a beat-up Toyota Camry and thinks he found a half-inch mistake?" I pulled out my phone and made 2 calls, one to Rick, my lawyer, and one to Mr. Harrison, the code inspector. I was ready for the final public showdown. By 2:00 p.m., the situation was ridiculous. Karen was standing guard next to her questionable surveying stakes. A huge, scary-looking truck from a demolition company with a large skull and crossbones decal on the door, had parked on the street. The demolition foreman, a barrel-chested man named Gus, was arguing with Karen about payment and liability. And then the sergeant, cavalry, arrived. First, Mr. Harrison's plain white sedan pulled up. Second, 2 police cruisers. This time, I knew the officer. It was the young guy from the first noise complaint, plus his female supervisor, Sergeant Reynolds. Sergeant Reynolds approached me first, shaking her head. "Alex, again? What is it this time? Is the Granite running for HOA president?" "A contested easement, Sergeant. Karen claims my wall encroaches by half an inch. She hired a demolition crew." The young officer from the first interaction walked over, looking at the wall with genuine amusement. "Alex, you are my favorite kind of menace. Did you call us, or did the Granite itself call us?" Mr. Harrison, the code inspector, bypassed everyone and went straight to the wall. He was holding my original blueprints. He pulled out his laser level again. He carefully set it up, ignoring Karen's hysterical protests. "Mr. Alexander, do you have your original survey on hand?" Harrison asked. I calmly retrieved the official, signed survey from my folder and handed it over. Harrison compared my document to his blueprints, and then compared both to the laser reading on the wall. He looked over at Karen, who was practically vibrating with anticipation. "Ma'am," Harrison said, his voice cold and definitive. "The original survey shows the wall is perfectly compliant. The foundation was set exactly on the line. The current laser reading confirms the structure is precisely where it should be. Furthermore, I have verified with the Municipal Utility Department that the easement you cite does not exist in this specific boundary section. Your surveyors are incorrect, and your claim of encroachment is null and void." He turned to the demolition foreman, Gus. "Gus, you're on notice. If you touch this structure, you are committing criminal property damage. This wall is fully permitted and inspected." Gus looked at Karen, whose face was collapsing in real time. "Sorry, lady. My permit for demolition is based on a valid encroachment. This guy's got the city's stamp. We're out." Gus and his crew packed up and drove off, leaving Karen standing next to her pathetic little wooden stakes. Sergeant Reynolds walked over to Karen, her expression completely serious. "Ma'am, you need to remove these markers immediately. This is not a legal matter anymore. If we get another complaint about this structure, it will be considered harassment. You need to stand down." Karen, utterly defeated, walked back to her house without another word. The granite wall had won the final, decisive victory. The HOA board, which had watched the whole chaotic spectacle from a safe distance, realized they were bleeding money and credibility. They knew that if I wanted to, I could sue them for months of legal fees, forcing them to pay for my lawyer, Rick, who was already drafting a cheerful, devastating invoice. Instead, Tom, the weary HOA president, called me 2 days later with a peace offering. "Alex," he sighed, "look, the wall stays. It's beautiful. It's legal. We surrender. We are broke and we are tired. Here is our proposition. We will officially drop the original $500 fine and credit your account for the amount. We will also pay for a custom-made, small brass plaque to be affixed to the wall on your side, recognizing its structural integrity and community contribution. In exchange, you agree, in writing, not to sue the HOA for any legal fees or emotional distress." A brass plaque. A permanent HOA-approved monument to my spite, paid for by the very people who tried to fine me. It was too good to pass up. "Tom," I said, genuinely touched by the level of institutional surrender. "You have a deal. Make sure the plaque is polished." A week later, a small, elegant brass plaque was installed on my side of the blue pearl granite. It read, "The Sycamore Heights Perimeter Barrier, installed August 2024, recognized for structural integrity and community contribution." It was the most beautiful, vindicating piece of text I had ever read. Months passed. The granite wall stood, silent and shimmering, a perfect, unmoving monument to the sheer absurdity of suburban life. It had survived the initial fury, the legal challenges, the viral fame, and Karen's final desperate attempt at sabotage. I was sitting on my deck one crisp autumn evening, enjoying the low, residual heat radiating off the stone. The backyard was quiet, sheltered, and peaceful. I looked over toward Karen's house. She was standing at her kitchen window, staring out at the wall, probably planning her next doomed move. She hated it, but she couldn't deny its existence. It was permanent. As I raised my mug of coffee, I caught my own reflection in the polished surface of the blue pearl. Then I saw Karen's reflection, staring back at me from her window, perfectly framed in the shimmering stone. I gave a final, cheerful wave to the wall. Karen's reflected image, in my beautiful, expensive granite, seemed to wave back. A wall of polished granite. It turns out spite is an excellent, long-term, structurally sound, and non-depreciating investment. And Karen had paid for the plaque.